Well, it has been a while, but we've just been a little busy. So, we're wanting to get back in the swing of things here. We're on a client project, and we got some React stuff to talk about. And then maybe we'll circle back, seeing how long this takes us, and talk about headless UI stuff, because that was the last thing I think we were going to talk about on the pod.
I think that's we should do a whole episode on that. Let's do a whole episode. Let's do it today.
Cool. Oh, talk about it now?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking it'd be fun to talk about the stuff we have on our mind because we've just been working on it.
Okay.
Let's start with that.
Can we record this intro? Because this is just weird.
No. No. Actually, I want all of this to be in there. You got to get back into the swing of things here. Yeah. It's off the cuff, man.
A little rusty.
Off the cuff. No planning. It's like jazz music, And we just lost half of our subscribers. Thank you very much for the most boring podcast ever. So we are working on some React code, and which has been fun. And we want to talk. Really, I just wanted to use the podcast as an excuse to talk about this because we were talking about it on Slack and we were working and stuff. So we figured it was better for an in-person conversation. But let's just get right into it. I was working on some auth code. And which is always like the simplest part of any app, I think. So we were running into this issue where there was some re-rendering happening that I wasn't really thinking about. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my self view here. This is a little hot tip that I learned during COVID. You just you hide your self view like that, boop, and now look at that. I just get to see Ryan's beautiful, smiling, bearded face. That's all I get to see. And it's way, way better. So here's the deal, Peter. When you log in, the question is, do you redirect somewhere as a result of a successful login? Or do you re-render your app somewhere higher up as a result of a change in the auth state of the user?
Well, I don't think it matters. I mean, my personal preference would be to have a reactive system and to have somewhere higher up in the tree re-render, because we didn't have a user. You logged in, we now have a user. And I just want my whole template, my whole website to react to that. React, see what I did there? But I don't think it matters if you needed to redirect. If you were like, listen, I have a constraint, I have to do a redirect here, I think you can still code that. I don't think that wouldn't be my preference. I would argue against that. But if you said you had to do that, we can still make our login form work in React and be a well-behaving React component.
Right. So I think the reason it was interesting is because it got me thinking more generally, which is like, so first we have this idea of like declarative versus imperative code. And React helped us understand, and I think the UI community and the web understand this distinction like more clearly than we had in the past. Back in the day, you would have like a slide down toggle from jQuery UI where you click a button and it slides down, and you're doing it like on click, then slide down. But then what if there's some other way to click the button, like hitting the space bar when it's focused, and now your slide down doesn't work? So that helps you understand whether this thing is sliding down or up is really not dependent on whether the user clicked something or did an event. It's not event driven as much as it is state driven. If there's some piece of state that is open is true, it should open. And how that state can change varies, and it usually changes over the course of an app being developed. So the UI being a function of state, that's kind of what we mean when we say that. And so whether the panel is open or not should be derived from state. Then you have things like logging in. So you fill out an email and password and you click a button and then you run some code. So now we're back to this like, or submitted the form, right? So you could have a handle submit, but the user took an action and now you want to run some code. So already it's like we've left this declarative world and we're doing some imperative work as a result of an event. So that's fine, right? That's fine because there's an event that happened. You need to respond to that. And you're not rendering UI right now. You're running some logic that needs to happen as a result of this event. But then the UI comes right back into the picture, because if the user successfully logs in, you need to do something with the UI, right? So I think this is where, at least for me, I can start to get confused and add bugs that I'm not really thinking about, because I already have this handle submit function where I'm making a request to the backend to log the user in. I get the token. That's all well and good. And then I'm like, all right, well, what needs to happen next? Okay, I redirect them to the dashboard. But as you pointed out when we were talking today, we're back to that same thing where I'm just thinking about the user clicking the button and I didn't think about them hitting the space bar. So there's actually a couple things that can happen here is that, let's say you open a tab in another window and you log in. Now you have a state change. So this is another way that the user's auth state has changed. And if your UI is truly a function of state, then it should update regardless of how the user logs in, whether they submit the form themselves using a keyboard or mouse, or whether someone else, another browser window, even submits the form. And so, it was just kind of an interesting moment, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And one way to think about this too is like, you can go in the weeds a little here, but if you think about like how Apollo works out of the box, they say, listen, you put something in local storage, you put like a JWT in local storage, and then here's some code you paste into your Apollo client, and we're going to send this off with every request. So like whether the user's logged in or not really depends on, is there a JWT in local storage? And so you like, oh, okay. Also, it has to be a valid JWT. So there's even more like states here, but you kind of want like, you want your system to like react to that. Like you want your system to say, okay, if there's a thing in JWT, I probably am logged in. You know, I can have, there's so many React hooks that can like read local storage or read cookies and just be reactive. So you don't have to think about like polling them, because at the end of the day, it is polling, but you don't think about that. Like you're just writing it as like, if there's something in local storage, then I should consider myself logged in. Maybe I like go to the backend to validate it. But yeah, I really like the
right. So that's wrapping some of the imperative code inside of a boundary, and then thinking about your UI as a function of the state behind that boundary. But you know, you mentioned the use cookies thing too. You could do the same thing. You have like a use cookies hook, and now you don't care how the cookie changes, which the browser would automatically change it if another tab had logged in. You now have a cookie, and that hook is watching it. And if you're describing your UI from the state of the cookies, then you'll already have considered these different code paths, which weren't obvious to you when you were coding the login flow, you know?
Yep. Yeah. Because you have going back to the Apollo thing, you have a JWT in local storage. That means you are going to make authenticated requests. Does your UI reflect that?
Right.
And so thinking about like, how do I not have to think about that? But how does the world just magically update?
Right.
I think it should be the goal with React.
Right.
Coinbase does a really good job at this. If you like open up a few tabs and like you log in one and like have to verify
you click an email link.
One, it's just every single window just automatically updates, and it's impressive.
Yeah, it's hard to do that well.
Yes, it's extremely hard to do it well. I think React gives you or these web UI frameworks give you the tools to do it. You just have to change your thinking. But even with that, it's hard. If you're writing effects, it's really hard. At least with React, we have a whole bunch of hooks that can just hide all the effects for us. But yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, going back to like you were saying, you know, you would argue for this, but you like the other way would work. But like this, I mean, one of the interesting questions here for me is like, I think it's good. You know, we're always like, is this the right way to do that? I think in this case, this is the right way to do this. So I think an interesting blog post that our friend from the Ember community wrote a while back was talked about this rideshare program, which was like Uber, where a lot of the UI was driven from server state. And so normally when we build kind of front ends on the web, we think about the user clicking links to navigate around. But in an app like Uber, the state of the UI is not really mostly done by that. It's mostly done by the state of the ride, which lives in the server. So you can close your app, reopen it, and it won't show you the home screen and ask you to click a link. It'll say you're currently in a ride right now, and it'll show the ride. So the auth stuff and being logged in to render the dashboard is kind of reflective of that. But one part where it got tricky today was that we still have the address bar in all of our web apps. And so, remember that Tom Dale back in the day had that presentation on Ember where he showed your URL and it's like that's the root state of your app and your like UI is really a materialized view of that. But then when you consider something like the auth state, it's no longer true, right?
Yep.
It's part of it, but it's no longer completely true. So now your UI is really a function of the URL plus some server state. And I guess that's true anyways. If you go to like /post/all, it's going to be a function of the URL plus what's in the database at the time of the request and the backend.
But this way of thinking that you're describing it's really important because it shows you that like this isn't the homepage isn't just a static page of posts that I just happened to fetch 5 minutes ago. I should be thinking about this as if it were like I was directly connected to the database, streaming all posts. Now that's really hard to do, but
that's like the logical conclusion of this.
Yeah, and it's good. You don't have to build every app like that. In fact, most apps we build aren't like that. But it's good to be thinking like that because then you can just be like you can be safe to re-renders. Is a way to think about it.
That's the thing you're always so good about bringing up when we do React is like React can re-render your app at any time, and it should be able to. I mean, if you're coding good React, it should be able to.
Yeah.
You also reminded me we used to talk about like the see new tweets where the query is really not all the tweets in the database. It's the latest 100 tweets as of 2:35 p.m. and then that's it. And then if you want to show that there's new tweets, that's a second query, which is like how many tweets have there been since 2:35 p.m. until right now, and that controls that part of the UI. So again, your app is it's never going to be stale because you fully described the needs, the data needs. And it's reactive. You could switch it from polling to Ajax to WebSockets and everything would still work in theory.
Yep. It's just a good way to think. And the tweet thing you're not saying like you don't always have to show the latest tweets because that would just be like a fire hose of tweets. But when you encode like, okay, I have a connection to all the tweets, but I'm only showing the tweets as of, or before 2:30 so that the homepage looks static. Someone can read it. It makes the UI so much easier to code.
Right. So that's all well and good and interesting. But then kind of the next layer here is that it has to do with some of the transitions piece. So, and what's the valid state of your application. So in particular, the one I ran into today was you have a homepage. It renders like a splash screen if you're not logged in, or it renders a dashboard if you are. And if it's rendering the splash screen because you're anonymous, you can click login and it goes to /login. And then it gives you the form and then you fill it out and get redirected back home. So there was a kind of an intermediate state that was rendering that was giving me a weird UI because the user was on /login, but they were now authenticated. So you click sign in, you get back the token, and now your use auth hook gives you a user, and you are still on /login, and the router hasn't redirected yet. Now that's you also have like a 304-ish redirect for users who are logged in and visit /login. So like this is how Twitter works. If you're logged into Twitter and you visit twitter.com/login, you're going to get a 304 to twitter.com/home, and you're never going to see the login route. So I was thinking about this in terms of like modeling the valid states of the app. And so really being on /login and having a token, an auth token, is like an invalid state of the app. Mm-hmm. It logically, from a business logic perspective, you're saying that this should never occur.
Yeah.
And
I
then
need to log out before I can see this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you were thinking about this in like an exhaustive way, like with a state machine, that thing would never appear and there'd be no way to transition to it. Right. Mm-hmm. And then we're also thinking about it, if you're thinking about it in terms of TypeScript and what are enumerating the valid states of the app, this wouldn't be one of them. And so, again, kind of going back to your point of like your React app should always be able to re-render at any time, because if UI is a function of state and you have some way to verify that the state is always correct, your UI should always be correct there. But this was a tricky one because just by the nature, okay, so there's a couple layers here. By the nature of the tools we're using, you actually could get React into this place where the user had a token and the use auth hook returned a token, but the current route was still /login because the way you redirect is by calling router.push in Next.js, and then it uses an effect here to queue up the next render with a path of /.
Yeah, let's just say you're pushing and it's got to download megabytes of data, so it's not always instant. But I think here is like, if this truly is an invalid state, you can't rely on redirecting from login. Like basically, as soon as your state machine is in this state where I'm on login and I have a valid authentication token, whatever we're going to say, something updates, something re-renders and unrenders.
It's
that
one
login
step
screen.
instead of two.
Yeah, I mean, you always, like in React, you always render, right? But there's something. It's not up to the login screen to redirect away because that might take time. So there's something above login that says like, okay, you just set a authentication token, and so I can't render login. So now I have to switch the component to something else.
Right. Okay, so let's take that case though. But even still, let's just say as a side effect of how hooks work. So if you had a state chart, you would say you could go from unauthenticated @/login to the home page as a logged in user, and there would be an arrow there, and it would be like an action that would be like logging in is a valid action, right? It's valid. And if you looked at like the entire state of your app, which was like your user and your path, it would be like user is null, path is login, and then it would be like user is Sam, path is home, path is /, and that's it. But because we're working with libraries that have different things, you have a router in Next.js, you have, let's say you're using some library for auth, and let's say the way those are implemented will let you render the app kind of in that in-between state where you're on /login. Now your use auth hook is updated with Sam, but you're still at /login. So now you have to deal with that state. So from a business logic perspective, you shouldn't have to. Like, again, if you were in TypeScript or if you were doing a state chart, this is like a thing that could never exist. But you find yourself in this situation where, because of the way effects run and all of these things happen, some things are synchronous, some things are asynchronous, you have to deal with this.
You're just saying like your hands might be... Okay,
yes.
So sorry. Your hands might be tied because of the library. Because I think my answer here is like, you can deal with it in like app.js. Can just
so you can deal with it in the sense that you can make the UI render something for that set of variables of the app state. But you have to deal with that. And really, conceptually, I think you shouldn't have to. Ideally, if you were able to, like, you think about all the... You never render. Yes. You see what I'm saying? You never have to render, what happens if someone opens up the console and, changes this value? What's going to happen to my app? Because it's like an invalid state that you shouldn't have to account for. That's like why we use things like TypeScript or state machines. We're trying to exhaustively list the possible states of our app, so we only deal with them, and then that's it. We don't have to account for states that don't exist. Or shouldn't exist. But in this case, it's a state that you shouldn't have to account for, but you kind of do. So you fake it in root somewhere and you account for this exception so that your UI doesn't flash to your users. From your user's perspective, you're going from one state to another. But in reality, React is going from 1 to 2 to 3. It's like 1.5, right? It's like 1.5 to 2. But 1.5 is not a valid state of your app.
I don't know if I agree.
I know you don't. That's why I wanted to talk about it on the podcast.
So with the console thing, just going back to I don't know, there's a persona of an unforgiving React developer that it's basically me that always tells you you're wrong.
Right.
Your React app should be reactive to I go into React DevTools and I start changing state. It should be reactive. If it's not reactive to that, you have a bug. Now the reality is I've never ever come close to writing a React app.
A fully react
that's
app.
fully reactive.
Yeah.
I rely on things like doing steps and click handlers and
Yeah.
and just knowing that like, yeah, I know you're never on this page. Like
Right.
if you're on this page, like you're an admin, like users aren't going,
right.
you know, I make a lot of assumptions and
Right.
really like it lets you ship apps faster because you're not needing to consider 5,000 extra states.
Right.
But I think that would be like the purest argument here that like, the app should be coded in a way that's fully reactive. The tools aren't there. Like you're describing a state chart where you can describe everything and if it's valid or not. And like that would be awesome because right now we do that and we
in our
do
head.
it by, and we approximate it with like effects and if statements and it's just messy.
But I think we're still talking about two slightly different things. I understand you can be you can have things that aren't reactive but should be, so that if you introduce some new way to change the state, you haven't had to think about it. The transition takes care of it for you. I'm talking about the fact that, let's say instead of using next router.push and instead of using some auth library that controls it, you're just writing vanilla React all yourself, and you've written a router yourself where you get to like call set current path, and you've written an auth hook where you get to call set current user. After that login comes back, you would effectively do like set app state, and you would update both of them at once in one pass. You know, the way we call set state on an object and like make sure current user is Sam and status is authenticated. So you don't have you would never do that in two separate calls and then want to account for two separate renders of your React app, because that's not a possible state of your app. You should be able to exclude that from your mental space from the program to say it's never possible to have a current user of Sam and a auth state of authenticated, right?
A route state of /login.
Yeah, or route state of /login. I was using as an example like a state, like an auth state, but yes. But it's the same thing with the login thing. Exactly. So I was wanting some API for saying like, you know, at that root level, what are the valid things? And then when you don't have it, it's like you just want to like not render, but like React has to render every time.
Yeah.
It's like, again, it's really an artifact of the way these libraries are working, and they're composable, like they're made to be composable, but then you realize because sometimes they can trigger renders based on their implementation or whatever, you don't have the ability to orchestrate the state transitions always in a way you'd want. Like your auth state hook is calling set current user, and React has to re-render because React state just changed. And that's a part of the black box that is working with React. You don't have any control over that. And if it does that in isolation, but there are certain other values of your application state that aren't valid when that is true, now you have to deal with this new thing that you shouldn't have to.
I think that's where I think where I'm nodding along until you say you shouldn't have to. Like, you don't control the URL, and so like you could set some state while you're on login, and you need to render, and then you can decide what to do. Like, do I render the splash screen at this point? It's
almost like what if you had something outside of React that was handling your business logic, and then you tell it to log in, and then it does all of its stuff, and then it returns back like props, which is like current user Sam, current path /. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Like, really, this is like a layer outside of it, and then you want to come back and re-render the app with those two values.
Yeah, I mean, really, you want to like set intermediate state. You're like, I want to set some state. I don't want to re-render. But the thing is, it's like this is where like you always get bit, because then you use some other hook that forces a re-render, because there's always time in between, like in between that stuff. So it's you don't control the URL. So given that you can be on login, you can set state with a current user, and you have to render something, we always just write something like, we render a loading spinner at this, right? Like, because you're probably logging in, and we're redirecting you.
And you can make it. Of course, you can code the exceptions so that your UI never exposes this impossible state, right? So you just account for this thing that you know is intermediate, and you just render something that's like a loader that's going to be the same as the previous state, which was loading or something like logging in or something like that. But it's kind of bizarre because it really is, from a business perspective, an impossible state of your application, and yet you find yourself with that state in your application. I think
there's like two things here. There's like, it's impossible from like the product point of view, but then it's like possible from like just how the browser works. Like you set current user while you're on login. Like those two things.
I know, but true. What if you could set current user and current route,
But you don't control the route. I mean, you're like,
that's like, part of why. Well, that actually is part of why this is tricky because the hooks that are the router hooks are having to use effects to navigate the page. So in Ember, we have the before model hook when you navigate around the app, which is responsible also for rendering. But because they're tied together, you can do something and basically like this, pause rendering. You like pause rendering. And once you enter before model, you don't do anything until you get all the way through. Or if there's an exception, it goes out. But that is the kind of...
Okay, that's fair.
That shields you from that. In the same way, that's a time block you have, a space where you can do something and then say, now this is the new valid state of my application. It's actually similar to visiting it on a server. If you go to twitter.com/login and you're logged in, that's the time block. And the only page you get back is the new one. So the user's only seen the 2 pages and you never have to account for the UI where you don't have it because you have time to do it.
The Ember router before model thing is fair, and that validates what you were saying in that, like, you don't have to render. You can stop the render.
Right.
You can wait for the world to settle.
Right.
And then you can say, I'm actually not going to continue down this. I'm going to, my state chart, I'm going to draw a little arrow over to the next state.
Exactly.
But in React, like, I think that's like a decision in React that we don't have that. We always...
Well, totally. And then there's also... Right, exactly.
Don't stop the render.
Don't interrupt the data flow or whatever, right? Because now, if you're in before model and you're waiting on like an async function to run before you can determine the new state, you can't have hooks or components over here. I mean, you can. Ember doesn't block the thread or anything like that, but conceptually, the router is like in a paused state that is like doing that. So then you introduce other abstractions like transition.abort and stuff like that. So to deal with that intermediate state when you're in one of those pre-navigation hooks. So it's just kind of interesting, and it's like, it's kind of tricky too. So now we're having like, I liked thinking about this because as we build out the app, there's certain pages that are public and certain that are protected, and then your auth state can change as well. So then it's like, it just becomes very crystal clear that the UI, like even what to let render is determined by some server-side state in addition to the URL. So I would like a unified theory here, or like a one way to think about it. I don't like when auth and login are like feel like exceptions. The rest of the app, you just build it like you just create a page. When the user's URL matches that page, you fetch some data and render it. And this feels very different. And so it feels like we're at a wrong layer of abstraction. There's some way to represent the what to render. And there's like a constraint that you could put in, you would have like a page, you would be able to like define constraints that might be async or depend on something. But it makes it very clear. And then Next or React stops you from rendering when you haven't, like those constraints are indeterminate or not yet determined. You know what I mean?
Stops you from rendering is interesting. By the way, this what you just said, it just all goes back to like that Uber app, because that's exactly you're just describing that. When you're describing this, I'm just imagining that.
Yeah.
Stopping you from rendering. I mean, you could imagine like a state machine that's like has like the valid states of your app, things that are invalid, and then like when like okay, I'm in a spot that's like invalid, what do I do? And you get like some splash screen that's just like, I don't want to just start rendering stuff and put you in an awkward spot. So given that you haven't defined this as like a valid state, I'm going to just render a splash screen. And then when the world settles, I'll render what, the next best valid state.
Or if it was outside of React, you could just not do anything and don't pass new props into your React tree or whatever. And then, you know what I'm saying? So if there was a layer outside of React,
I wonder if more business logic moves to that layer, and then you need another layer outside of that layer, and you know what I'm saying? You just inception yourself.
Well, that's how I think the state machine that we used for REPL with the use state machine XState stuff was like had some of that stuff in it. I don't remember if it was all inside of React or not.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, some was outside, and then we could trigger. I think when state changed, it would re-render, but it would always have like a valid state when it was re-rendering. So if we had inner, but man, that like that
there's
API
tension.
was
There's
hard
tension
to deal with.
It is, and there's tension between pulling state out of React because you just you lose a lot of the benefits. There's a ton of benefits with having state tied to a component instance, and you get all the composability benefits that you get with components that you do with hooks. So there's a nice that's really nice because it just ties to it. The ephemerality of it, the component unmounts and you just clean up all the state. Yep. So that one's tricky. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what we're at land up. But for now, I think I just did an effect in the root app component. I think that's what I did. And I just say if it's just a case, if your current path is /login and you have a user, you shouldn't be there. So let's just redirect you.
Nice.
And then I also had to have the exception in the tree. So before I was like, the root app component is like, if you're logged in, render the logged in layout with whatever page you're on. If it's public, if you're if you're logged in, render the page. If you're logged out, render this thing. If it's public, and then otherwise render like a 404 or like this page is not found. And then it's like you have this other thing that's at the beginning. Well, if you're actually logged in and you're on log in as well, just render the same loading spinner that you render at the beginning when your auth state is basically unknown, because that's really the user case you care about. If someone happens to be visiting /login for some reason, but they're already signed in. So then the UI doesn't change at all. It can re-render all day, and you're not going to see a new state from the UI's perspective. But I'll always know that code is in there, and it's going to bother me.
Yeah. I mean, you could also say, like, look, you can be logged in and on the login page, and it's like valid. It is a valid state because, like, I just clicked the login button. I got back a token. And I haven't yet transitioned to the new place I'm supposed to go. So actually is like a valid state. I should be here. I should see loading spinners, like the login.
It's something that a user can do to your app.
Yeah. Yes.
That's true. That is true.
But that's where it's like, okay, but then like from a product point of view, you might not describe it like that. So this is where it gets tricky, where like,
Yeah, it is tricky.
Man, there's so many cases like this. Just
I know.
Like JWTs that are expiring.
Yeah.
Like things that change in the back end, and all this stuff is getting like more and more connected, right? We have like GraphQL subscriptions, we have JWTs that expire after 15 minutes. It's just this stuff is like really, it's harder and harder to deal with.
It is harder to deal with,
or it's harder and harder to ignore, I guess, is a way.
It is harder to ignore because if you were making websites 20 years ago, you don't have to do anything until the user takes an action. But that's really what's changed in a lot of ways. And that's a super simple model. And maybe we should just go back to that because it makes it really, really easy.
And then you want to make a panel slide down, and now we're back in React land.
Show if your friends online too, or something like that. Or show a new message. I mean, any sort of chat doesn't work with that. You'd have to like click refresh, right?
Yeah.
But maybe we all should just go back to forums anyways. Maybe real-time chat and social media was like a huge mistake.
There's a thread on Twitter about controlled inputs in forms being a mistake. And so like I never really even thought of this before, but as an alternative, just having inputs, and then when you submit the form, read the values from the event, like the submit event form, because you can get the form, you can get the inputs.
I saw this. Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. Just going back towards, like,
simpler APIs,
simpler times. Yeah.
That ignore that maybe don't account for certain things, but also account for other edge cases, so you don't have to. Yeah, I think that came up on my feed as well, because Ryan and Michael had been demoing Remix on YouTube, and the way Remix's form API works is exactly like that. You actually don't even do an on submit. You don't have any React state for each input. You don't do anything, because by default a browser will serialize a form, all of the values in the inputs. The HTML will do it for you, and it'll send it over. And by default, it'll send it over as a query string. But if you do method post, it'll send it over as a request body. So then all you do is you just submit the form, and you define a new function at the top of the page that's like action handler or something like that, action. And then it's going to get the data in from the form. So you just rely on the browser behavior to do it.
That action handler is running on the server?
Yeah.
Okay. I think this one, the one that I'm talking about, it was like on the client. Like
yeah.
Same idea.
Same idea, right. They then transition to, if you want to do some client-side stuff, like, what was their example? Yeah, just not a full page refresh. You want to do it on the client. You want to turn it into an AJAX request. Basically, all you do is you use like their capital form, you give it an on submit, but again, that's it. That's like the only two changes. And then you're still working with, there's this query params, URL query params browser API that knows how to take the serialized form and turn it into like JavaScript data, and then you can start interacting with it to get it. So it's like, just use it from the browser. Don't use React state.
Cool.
Yeah. But then they go to this place where you do want to set state because you want the values in React for some other reason. And so then it all kind of goes away. So that was cool. But I was thinking about opening an app that had like form, like 4 different ways to submit forms. And I was like, I wouldn't want to work on that.
Yeah. You want one way to do it. You don't want to think about it when you're setting it up.
Here's how you submit a form. On submit equals handle submit. Boom. You know.
You have to,
and just getting good with a form, like a formic or whatever, I think is good too. So yeah. I like that. That kind of turned me off in a sense, but I wasn't really. I was just watching it to learn, and I thought it was a really cool point. It was a really interesting point.
Nice.
What else has been going on, man? Can you think of any tweets of the week? Tweets of the last 2 months that we should talk about? We're going to start a segment to do that. We're going to have to get back into it as we get into the rhythm here again.
Yeah, I need some prep time.
Yeah.
I was
Hey, we just hit you with it, man.
I was thinking the other day, it's like anytime someone asks you this question, you should just go to like Pete Hunt's Twitter, because I think he has a
lot of interesting
high quality signal to noise ratio.
Nice. I have this thing actually in our podcast topic channel here from After Headless UI, which is design drives front end drives back end. Front end thinks of the query before the back end. This was a point you made on some work that we had been doing in the last couple months, which was really interesting. So, we are front end first after all, so it's only appropriate we talk about this. But, one of the reasons we are named that is because we have learned that ultimately driving software from the user and the value you're delivering at the end of the whole chain is a really good way to keep everyone focused on working on the right thing. Because it's easy for us technologists to get, bottled down and doing things that we think are interesting or important, but ultimately that aren't really doing anything for the user. So we work on Mirage, and one of the reasons we like using Mirage when we start a front end is because it helps us work faster at iterating on the front end, making sure we're building something that is useful to whoever is going to use the software. And some folks, I remember talking with Luke Millie back in the day, and we were kind of talking about, like, do you start with the front end and then, you're building the static mockup here, and then you start querying the data. And that's where we like to bring in Mirage, because we can write like Apollo query code that hits Mirage, and we can tweak like what the queries we need are. And then it's like, now it's working and it's ready. We maybe show those prototypes, maybe we iterate on them with the design team or users, but now we're ready. And so we already have like a spec for the API contract that our front end expects. You bring it to the back end, you implement it, boom, right? And everything's flowing from the front. And then he was kind of representing the opposite perspective, which other people think too, which is like, we have data, like let's say we're at TED or whatever, conferences, organizers, events, speakers, all these things. We can think of how these things exist and relate to each other. So let's start by modeling them and getting them in a logical structure in the database in the back end, and start there and expose them, and then kind of go from the back end to the front or whatever. So that's always just been that's an interesting thing. I think we could talk forever about why we think you should start with the front end, but it's pretty established. But I think one interesting kind of angle of this that you had made that I hadn't thought about before was like, this question comes up a lot. Like, should we start with like, do we build, as we're building an app, where do you start? Who kind of like knows more? Who should be like starting and driving? Who should be driving the needs of the thing? So do we have a team, do we have a bookshelf that has many movies on recommendations, or do we have a flat list and we do a join or whatever? And I think a lot of times people can think of like, and again, these are all the lessons that we've kind of gone through and learned over the last few years, is like, you can think of like the data and how you organize it and query it and send it back and forth as like a backend concern, because that's where the database is. And then you just tell the front end developers what to do. But again, like the front end developers know a lot about this in the same way that, and this is the point that you made, designers know a lot about what the front enders are doing. So this is more established in software workflow, right? The designer is creating the mock-ups and the designs, and they're even closer to the user. So they know better about that stuff. That's what their profession is. That's what their job is. The best designers are like super empathetic with the users and making sure that the things that they're learning and the UX and UI practices that they're using in their mock-ups and everything and their designs are the best for the user. And then the front end developer is going to look at that and build it. I mean, it's not even a question. Like you get a Photoshop or a Figma mockup, and that's what the front end developer builds. Now, of course, there's like communication all along the way. And then there's times where the front end developer can say, either this thing you showed me in the design is like really hard. Is it really worth building it? Or the front end developer can say, hey, we've done this. Actually, the last 4 times we use a select drop down, it was, we had these problems. What about this other thing that we could use here? This other design pattern that we could use for the UI to make this better. So there's obviously back and forth, but no one questions that like design is ahead of the front end.
Yeah,
it just is. Like if you come into a project, you'll have like 40 screens designed, and before you've built one page.
It's also interesting that the designs don't depend on any work that the front end team has done.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if you're using React. It doesn't matter if you're using Tailwind. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It's just
it's literally an implementation detail.
Yeah, the designer can do everything, can provide all the recommendations for how it should look without prescribing any of the implementation.
Now that actually, what if you're only using Rails and you don't get any JavaScript? Well, then it would leak forward, and you would say we can't do that.
Everyone makes static designs. No one ever puts.
No, it's actually an interesting point, though. It's like it's not airtight completely, but It's extremely airtight. If you're not on a native app, maybe you can't do push notifications, so the designer can't do that. So in that way, the designer can be constrained by the technology of the front end, but in general, it's a strong flow in that direction, right?
Where with the front end and back end, it's almost like everyone's like, whoa, before you write any code, I need to be involved. And just that, it's just, I don't know what it is. And hey, maybe these design tools will like start exporting CSS, and then this area between designers and front end will get just as murky as the area between front end and back end. But
interesting.
But that's not the world we're in today. And it's something I noticed that like, it's really hard to figure it out with a front end and back end when you have 2 different teams. And I kind of think that's like one of the appeals of like full stack developers these days. You either have someone that does both front end and back end that can kind of make all those decisions, because there isn't a clear firewall that the designer and the front end programmer have between back end and front end. Or the other approach is like you literally use a tool where you get no say over the front end or the back end. So you do like some WYSIWYG editor for front end code, or like some serverless Hasura type thing for back end code. So I just went in like a million directions.
No, I know. But I think you need to take like a stronger stance on the ground here, dude. I don't think the design in front end is going to get more murky. I think it's a mistake that the front end and back end isn't as clear cut, and there aren't those firewalls.
Oh.
And even if you're a full stack developer, like we're both full stack developers, we work on our own apps. I still treat this exactly the same way. In the same way I do design. I would do design first, and I would do it on paper first, and then do it in Figma. And of course, I'm thinking about the front end implementation, but by and large, the arrow is pointing in the one direction. And then I would do the front end with Mirage if I'm doing a SPA, and I wouldn't start the back end at all. Or, I mean, these days I try to avoid writing that if possible using something like Hasura, because why do it at all? But it's the same idea. And so I think it's a mistake that the culture is not like that between the front end and back end. Again, regardless if you're using a full stack framework like Rails or not, because it's more user centric that way. And it's like, it shouldn't be influencing it as much. So I think it's a mistake.
I agree with you. And like, just in like the, if I was going to have to pick a side, I would say, design drives front end drives back end.
Right.
I will say though that your front end person, I think, becomes a full stack developer. The front end person is thinking about the back end stuff, the back end implementation.
Yeah. They need to understand, in the same way that a designer needs to understand the capabilities of the platform. They can't just start.
I think it's harder. I think the front end person needs to know more about the back end than the designer needs to know more about the front end.
Interesting. That's a good question. I mean, that's an interesting question.
I think tools like Mirage can help you.
Yeah. Because they abstract away the details of the back end implementation. You don't have to know about database indexes to be able to write a production ready React app that is able to query and mutate a GraphQL server. You know,
you don't even know about database indexes. You don't care about N+1ing on the back end. All
you
that
don't know how
stuff.
to set up a Linux server. You don't have to know how to write SSH.
Well, and for that, I mean, you just use Docker, right? Like that's it. You just use Docker. So.
Yeah, everyone should be able to do that. I mean, it's simple enough. That's interesting. But I think I think it's going to move more in that direction, because I think the trends in software and app development are moving in a way that empower people who are closer to the user to deliver experiences.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is a whole no code thing, right?
Right.
So you don't need to be a programmer to be empathetic with your users, and
right.
You just don't.
Exactly. And even lower down in level than no code is absolutely true. But even if you're saying, oh, I'm not interested in that, or that's not going to pan out, it is panning out that like Firebase is replacing backends, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Like, just that's one way you can like keep this arrow flowing, is it can just dead end after front end. Right. Like imagine if the arrow had
there was that guy who I follow on Twitter, is so good. He was like, computer, design me an app with a title bar and a feed of photos and a like button and a place for comments and user sign up. And then it's like, boom. So, no, seriously. I mean, as crazy as if you told someone 20, 25 years ago that no one's going to have to know how to set up a database server ever again, they're just going to push a button to do it, they probably would have thought you're nuts. Maybe there's a day where no one has to write React UI code because, the tool you're using, the design tool does it, or, I don't know.
We'll finally be free. We can get back to our roots of running Docker containers.
Just run this Docker container and you can build an app. You too can build an app. I guess I'm going to go become a farmer. I have yet to run Docker. I'm really holding out. I never really used Redux on a production app before, and that ship has sailed. So I dodged a bullet there. Hoping to dodge a Docker bullet. Sam. Yeah, I love it. I mean, I love I held on React for a few too many years there, so that was an error in judgment. But here we are.
Yeah, but I
it's
would
really
like,
interesting though. Train of thought.
Yeah, I would like to see more. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's stuff like Mirage. I mean, Mirage is my best answer to this, but more tooling that allows a front end developer to work in a way that doesn't have implications on the
Right.
back end. Similar to how a designer can open Figma. It doesn't matter if you're using Material UI, Tailwind, BEM, they can design anything. And those, obviously like there's things like color scales and all that
Yeah.
that come into play. But
Yeah.
for the most part, it's very easy to point at what the implementation work is between those two.
Yeah. But it also is, I do think it's similar. There are a lot of facts about the implementation that do affect the design. I mean, if the designer is doing lots of different font sizes and colors, it makes it much, much harder to build and sometimes impossible.
Yeah.
If they're doing SVGs at the wazoo for things that they should be just making boxes or whatever, you know what I'm saying? There's some feedback loop that happens there. But yes, you're definitely right. Someone who has just done, well, that's the other thing is like these days.
That's really interesting. Like the designer is really constrained because if you ask someone to like paint a picture, they can go experiment with lines and colors but if you ask someone to design a website, they're like, they just know that like my inputs are rectangle boxes.
Yeah.
I can't make like a circle for an input.
Yeah. No, they're super constrained. I mean, and the nth degree of that is like a designer who brings to you Figma and describes how it all works. And you're like, I literally can't build that because I need like a team of like 20 C++ developer or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yep. Interesting. Okay.
So there are constraints that feed back in. And just like the constraints in the back end, it just demonstrates your point, which is that the back end constraints do feed in how you write the front end code. Of course, if you're writing GraphQL in the back end, like whether you have a GraphQL server to work with affects whether you use Apollo or not, right? That's a dependency there. But I think again, the arrow is much stronger in the other direction. And to your point, like if there's a front end developer who spent most of their time with HTML and CSS and some JavaScript, but hasn't done a lot of data fetching, they're not going to be able to give that production ready front end app. Just like if, there was a designer who had done print design and was great in like Adobe InDesign, but they had never designed for the web, they're going to have a hard time. So they need to learn about the web and the constraints and capabilities. And in the same way, the front end developer needs to learn about the constraints and capabilities of basically HTTP and REST and GraphQL and how all that works and sessions. So those are the aspects of backend development the front end developer needs to be aware of and understand. Sessions and requests and responses and headers, basically HTTP. That's how it all works. So data normalization comes up there, all that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that really matters the most. But that's so that was just interesting. And again, I think that like the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the hot take here is like that this is a failing of the culture. And really, since we're all trying to serve the users the best, it should be a bigger part of the culture. It should be a more well understood point. It should be more agreed upon. In the same way that if the front end developer was in a room with the 6 designers on the design team and starts, telling them how to do their job, everyone would be like, "What are you doing? That's not your job. We're the designers." We know,
of course.
we know what the user wants. We've been sitting here doing user testing and talking with them, and we know why the button needs to be this big because they're using it on an iPad. All those 10 million things that come up. Those are the things that aren't as clear in I think our understanding, but you and I believe are true, and lots of people do that. The front end developer knows all those tiny things about the HTTP layer, independent and irrespective of database technology, the server side language, all that stuff.
Absolutely, the front end developer can describe how a search query gets sent over.
Right.
The backend developer can decide how you actually match that term against a database of 5 million records.
Exactly.
It'd be interesting to like take a front end developer with no backend experience and teach them everything they need to know to work with Hasura like basically draw a hard line after Hasura. So they learn HTTP, they learn data fetching, they're exposed to all that, and then drop them in. And that's also like that's like a good environment to learn in. Like it's constrained. It's just a good environment to learn backend stuff in. There's like a very clear line. And then drop them in a team that, your typical like front end backend team, and just see like if they're able to communicate with the backend developers and all that stuff. And I think they would be. I mean,
I think so too. Like even if the backend developers weren't using Hasura, you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
If they were using a completely different technology, would they have learned the principles enough?
Basically, like when I was using Hasura, as long as I could describe everything up to the Hasura line, I was successful. So if I can talk to my backend developers like that.
Right. And to be fair, I think they would too. And to be fair, like there's a ton to learn about Hasura. I mean, it's almost a question of what's the best way for the front end person to know enough about the constraints and capabilities of the back end to do their job the best. And it might be like to actually go and build a back end somewhere, because then you just learn it, It's hard though, because as the stuff you were saying, it's like now there's like these just huge like holes that you could fall into, like setting up a server and setting up a database, running Redis, running Elasticsearch to make a search as fast. I mean, I've done Redis. I've never done Elasticsearch directly, but it's just I think that's cool to think about that firewall. Pretty interesting stuff. It'd be fun. That'd be a fun course to make with Hasura or Mirage. Basically backend develop, like backends for front end developers, like learn backend development for front end developers, where you're able to use one of those abstractions, those serverless things, to teach. Oh, here's why we query like this. Here's how we think about loading and error. Here's how we think about data joins and what is the identity map and caching, and but you're doing it with a tool that is friendly enough to front end developers, and it doesn't get them bogged down and installing Ruby or PHP on their machine and getting Postgres running.
You can always, when you're using those tools, you can always ask yourself, like, is this the level of abstraction I should be at?
Right.
So when I'm using Hasura and I'm thinking about indexing,
right,
there's a little warning bell in the back of my head saying, whoa, you're not supposed to be thinking about this. This is Hasura's job.
Right.
So that just kind of keeps you on a path, and that path is everything you need to know to communicate with the backend.
Yeah. Yep. Everything you need to know to communicate with the backend. Podcast title. That was a cool conversation. I like that. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Cool. What do you say we wrap it? I think we just recorded a podcast, man. It feels a little strange, but I think we did it.
Good to be back.
It is good to be back. We got a new office here for the summer. Our old WeWork got taken by the man. They had to their dues were overdue, and the big bad collector came, shut down a building of 10 floors in New York City that was full of people at one point, and it was basically just us hanging on there for dear life. I think we might have been the last company there somehow.
I think we were there were days we would go and we'd be the only people there.
You know that meme with Pablo Escobar where he's just like no friends and his hands are behind it? That was like me. I would go into the office and I would just walk around, pretend like it was still a bustling New York City building. I'd just be sitting around like this, getting out of my apartment, looking around. And so now it's a lot better. We moved like an avenue away, and there's a bunch more people here. It's still pretty empty, but we're here for about 3 months at least. So yeah, we should have a more permanent setup and be able to do this weekly.
Yeah. Crazy thing about New York City, we literally moved one avenue, and it feels like we're in a whole different neighborhood. I mean, it feels like
town. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, there's like new bars, new restaurants, like all this stuff I have to learn. Like,
yep.
Yeah. So
that's funny.
Love New York, man.
I know. It is so fun. It's so nice out, and everyone's excited about being vaccinated and, being able to go around without masks. I met a buddy at a bar, And the waitresses, the wait staff were wearing masks inside. It's crazy.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's nuts. It's the first time I've seen
Awesome.
that in New York City. So it was super fun.
Cool.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us and listening. And, sorry for the hiatus, but hopefully you're glad to have us back in your ears. And we will plan on being back in them next week. So hope you all are doing well, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.